The Grand Synod of the Ethelgardian Ascendancy did not tolerate imperfection, nor did it abide the chaotic clamor of the physical universe. Within the spire of whispering light, all was silence, geometry, and the hum of containment fields holding back the void. Here, beneath the shimmering, translucent dome that looked out upon the curated constellations of the core worlds, the high archons gathered not to debate war, for war was a crude instrument of lesser species, but to discuss the final sanitation of the galactic rim. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and the psychic weight of disapproval, a collective pressure that made the air itself feel viscous. At the center of the chamber, suspended in a gravity-nullified column of pure light, floated the holographic representation of the problem, a swirling, discordant mess of jagged edges, rusted iron, and leaking radiation that marred the perfection of their borders. It was a fleet, if one could be charitable enough to apply such a dignified term to the drifting amalgamation of refuse that currently sat motionless in the deep dark of the outer sectors. They were the Terrans, the scavengers of the Orion Arm, creatures who had apparently failed to grasp the elegance of energy-state evolution, and had instead clung, with pathetic desperation, to the crudity of matter. Archon Valoris, his elongated form draped in robes that shifted color with his mood, currently a brooding, storm cloud violet, gestured with a slender, six-fingered hand toward the projection. His voice was not a sound but a resonance, projected directly into the auditory centers of the assembled counselors, a method of communication that bypassed the vulgarity of moving one's mouth. He spoke of the Terran presence as one might speak of a fungal infection on a masterwork painting, a blemish that required not military strategy, but simply a sterile wipe. To the Ascendancy, who had mastered zero-point energy and hull integrity based on hard light projection, the Terran ships were an absurdity. They were constructed of welded plates, bolted bulkheads, and repurposed debris harvested from the graveyards of dead civilizations. They were ugly, asymmetrical, and leaked heat into the vacuum like wounded animals. The Ascendancy's sensors, tuned to the delicate frequencies of dimensional harmonics, found the sheer density of the Terran vessels offensive. They were heavy, sluggish, and painfully, tragically physical. Strategist Kalen, younger and more prone to the anxiety of the practical, shifted in his levitation pod, his robes flickering with a nervous chartreuse. He did not share Valoris's absolute disdain, though he masked his hesitation carefully. While the Archons saw only trash, Kalen saw mass. The sensor readings from the Border Patrol were confusing, not because the Terran technology was advanced, but because it was so archaic that the Ascendancy's algorithms struggled to interpret it. There were no shields, at least not in the sense of frequency modulation barriers. There were no directed energy weapons powered by singularities. Instead, there were thick slabs of composite alloy magnetic accelerators that threw solid slugs of metal and engines that burned volatile chemicals. It was primitive, yes, but there was a scale to it that unsettled him. The sheer volume of the wreckage fleet was impossible to calculate without specific integers, and the Synod forbade the vulgarity of counting, but the visual feed showed a swarm of iron mountains drifting against the stars. Kalen attempted to interject, suggesting that perhaps the Terrans' refusal to adopt energy-based technology was a choice rather than a failure, but his resonance was drowned out by the wave of agreement that washed over the chamber from the other Archons. The consensus was reached with the speed of light moving through crystal. The Terran Rust fleet would be removed. They would be hailed, ordered to disperse and scuttle their abominations, and if they refused, the Ascendancy's immaculate silver needles, ships of such beauty they were considered art rather than weapons, would dissect them. The Ascendancy believed in the hierarchy of existence, a ladder where those who commanded energy stood at the top, and those who twalled in the mud of matter lay at the bottom. Humanity, with their ships built from the corpses of other ships, with their hulls scarred by micrometeoroids and their reliance on combustion, were the bottom feeders of the galaxy. They were the junk hoarders of the cosmos, dragging their garbage from star to star, searching for scraps. The Synod's decree was transmitted across the void, a message of arrogant benevolence offering the humans a chance to abandon their floating tombs and accept integration into the Ascendancy as laborers or face total atomization. The response from the Terran fleet did not come instantly. It did not travel on the superluminal subspace bands the Ascendancy used. It came hours late. R carried on radio waves, ancient, crackling, slow radio waves that the Ascendancy's communications officers had to patch through legacy filters just to hear. There was no image, only audio, a voice that sounded like gravel grinding against steel, accompanied by the background thrum of heavy machinery. The voice did not plead. It did not offer surrender. It simply stated coordinates and a single phrase. "We are the anchor. Come and break us if you can." The audacity of the challenge sent a ripple of amusement through the Synod. Valorous ordered the deployment of the Third Purification Wing, a collection of vessels so advanced they required no crew, piloted by the collective consciousness of the Ascendancy's combat algorithms. They were sleek, teardrop-shaped constructs of chrome and light, weapons of surgical precision designed to slice through shielding and detonate reactor cores. They moved to the coordinates provided by the humans, expecting to find a disorganized rabble. What the Third Purification Wing found in the silence of the debris nebula was a fortress. The humans had not just parked their ships, they had interlocked them. The sensor feeds transmitted back to the spire of whispering light showed a spectacle that defied Ethel Guardian aesthetics. The Terran ships, thousands of them, had deployed magnetic docking clamps and physical bridges, fusing their hulls together into a chaotic, sprawling wall of metal that spanned thousands of kilometers. It looked like a barricade built from the refuse of history. There were sections of hull plating that clearly belonged to long-dead empires, pieces of asteroid reinforced with rebar, and massive, unpainted domes of lead and tungsten. It was a mosaic of survival, a patchwork quilt of armor. The Ascendancy fleet, gleaming and symmetrical, approached this wall of junk with the confidence of a scalpel approaching necrotic tissue. They fired their particle lances, beams of coherent light capable of boiling the oceans of a small world. The beams struck the Terran wall, and nothing happened. On the bridge of the Ascendancy flagship, the resplendent silence, the mood shifted from arrogance to confusion. The particle lances, which relied on overloading energy shields and disrupting molecular bonds, had simply dissipated against the sheer, brute density of the human armor. The humans were not using shields. They were using mass. They were using layers of ablative armor so thick that the energy beams were absorbed, the heat spreading out across millions of tons of conductive metal, dissipating harmlessly into the cold of space. The junk was not fragile. It was dense. It was layers of ceramic, lead, water, and depleted uranium, scavenged from 1,000 worlds and welded into a hide that no elegant energy weapon could penetrate quickly. The Ascendancy fired again, increasing the output, but the result was the same. Scorch marks on the rust, glowing patches of slag, but no penetration. The Terran structure absorbed the punishment with a stoic, mechanical indifference. Then the Juggernaut woke up. The wall of debris shifted. Massive hydraulic mechanisms, large enough to crush a city, began to move. What the aliens had taken for random piles of scrap were actually camouflaged weapon ports. The garbage fell away, revealing the dark, rifled maws of kinetic cannons the size of skyscrapers. The humans did not fire lasers. They fired solid slugs of ferrous metal, accelerated to fractions of light speed by magnetic rails running the length of their massive ships. There was no hum of energy, only the silent, violent expulsion of matter. The projectiles crossed the distance in seconds. The Ascendancy ships, reliant on shields designed to disperse energy, were wholly unprepared for kinetic impact. Their shields flickered and died as the heavy slugs shattered the emitters through sheer momentum. The sleek silver hulls, built for beauty and speed, crumpled like foil. It was a massacre of the elegant by the brutal. Back in the spire, the Synod watched in horrified silence. The holographic projection showed their perfect needles shattering against the invisible hammer blows of the Terran barrage. Kalen, his robes now a panicked gray, realized the fundamental error of their philosophy. They had assumed that technological advancement meant moving away from matter, becoming lighter, more ephemeral. The humans had gone the other way. They had embraced the weight of the universe. They had turned entropy into armor. The Juggernaut, as the analysts were now calling the Terran formation, began to advance. It did not move with the grace of gravity drives. It moved with the thunderous output of fusion torches, spewing plumes of plasma kilometers long. It was slow, inexorable, and terrifying. The humans were not just surviving, they were advancing, pushing the line of the nebula forward, a creeping glacier of iron that the Ascendancy could not melt. The defeat of the Third Wing forced a pause. The Ascendancy, for the first time in millennia, felt the cold touch of fear. They did not understand this enemy. They could not predict a species that rejected the superior path of energy evolution. In a desperate bid to understand, they dispatched Ambassador Xylos, a diplomat known for his tolerance of the primitive, to negotiate a ceasefire. Xylos traveled not in a warship, but in a small, unarmed courier vessel, approaching the wall of iron with his shields down, broadcasting codes of truce. The humans accepted the hail. A docking bay opened in the side of a massive vessel that looked like a hollowed-out moon, the jagged metal teeth of the bay doors grinding open to swallow the tiny alien craft. When Xylos stepped out of his ship, the environment hit him like a physical blow. The air was heavy, recycled, but rich with the smells of ozone, machine oil, and heated metal. Gravity was set high, a crushing weight that made his slender bones ache. The docking bay was a cavern of activity, but it was not the silent, automated efficiency of Ethelgard. It was loud. Sparks showered from welding rigs where humans in exosuits were repairing hull plates. Enormous cranes moved containers of raw ore. The floor vibrated with the rhythm of engines that felt like the heartbeat of a dying star. Humans moved everywhere, small, bipedal, soft-skinned creatures encased in rough vac suits or worn fatigues. They looked tired, scarred, and undeniably alive. Xylos was escorted by a squad of soldiers whose armor was a patchwork of different styles and eras, yet maintained perfectly. They led him through corridors that were a maze of pipes and cables, past bulkheads where he saw artwork graffitied onto the metal, depictions of old Earth, of stars, of battles fought in the dark. He was brought to the bridge of the Hephaestus, the command hub of the fleet. There he met Admiral Vance. The human commander sat in a chair that looked more like a throne of salvaged parts, surrounded by analog screens and tactical maps printed on paper. Vance was an old man, his face a roadmap of stress and survival, with one cybernetic eye that whirred softly as it focused on the alien. He did not rise. He simply pointed to a metal stool bolted to the floor. Xylos, accustomed to floating gravity chairs, sat awkwardly, feeling the cold of the metal through his robes. He began his speech, the prepared remarks about the Ascendancy's benevolence and the misunderstanding of intent, but Vance cut him off with a raised hand. The human's voice was calm, deep, and devoid of the aggression Xylos expected. Vance explained the truth of the junk. He told Xylos that humanity had not failed to ascend, they had chosen not to. They had seen the ruins of civilizations that went the way of the Ascendancy, civilizations that became so reliant on energy, on the ethereal, that they forgot how to endure. The universe, Vance explained, was a hostile place. Energy runs out, fields fail, but matter remains, metal endures. The junk fleet was not poverty, it was history. Every plate on their ships came from a vessel that had died, and in repurposing it they carried the strength of the fallen. They were the recyclers of the galaxy, the ones who remembered that survival is not about being the sharpest blade but the hardest stone. Vance leaned forward, his human eye intense. He told Xylos that humanity did not want war. They wanted the debris nebula because they were building something, not a weapon but a shelter. The revelation confused Xylos. A shelter from what? The Ascendancy's sensors showed nothing threatening in this sector other than the humans themselves. Vance pressed a button on his console and a heavy shutter slid back from a viewport. He pointed into the deep black of the void past the nebula. At first, Xylos saw nothing. Then his spectral vision adjusted. There, at the very edge of perception, the stars were disappearing, not flickering out but being blotted out. A shadow was moving through the galactic arm, a phenomenon known in ancient texts as the Great Silence or the Null Tide. It was a cosmic weather event, a rolling wave of anti-energy that dampened all high-frequency fields. It was the reason the precursors had died. It was the reason the debris fields existed, and it was coming for them all. Xylos returned to the spire with the message, but the High Council, led by the obstinate Valoris, refused to believe it. They called it a primitive superstition, a trick to buy time. They ordered the full mobilization of the Grand Armada, the entirety of the Ascendancy's might, to crush the humans before they could spread their lies. The Armada launched, a sea of light composed of myriads of warships ready to burn the Rust Fleet from the sky. They engaged the humans in the open void, away from the nebula. The battle was catastrophic. The Ascendancy's superior numbers and speed began to tell. They flanked the heavy human ships, carving off chunks of more dissecting the juggernauts. The humans fought with savage stubbornness, their massed drivers filling the sky with steel rain, but they were being whittled down. Then the Null Tide arrived. It did not announce itself with a roar, but with a sudden, suffocating silence. The sensors on the Ascendancy ships went blind. The containment fields holding their antimatter fuel flickered. The hard light hulls, sustained by constant energy projection, began to dissolve. Panic erupted across the Ascendancy fleet. Their ships, the pinnacle of evolution, were turning into glass coffins. Without power, without the complex energy matrices that held their reality together, they were helpless. The Archons in the spire watched in horror as their screens went dark, the connection to the fleet severed. The superior technology was rendered inert by the cosmic storm. The sleek needles drifted, powerless, their crews suffocating in the dark. But the humans did not stop. On the bridge of the Hephaestus, the lights flickered and died, only to be replaced seconds later by the red glow of emergency chemical lamps. The hum of the fusion reactors deepened, struggling but persisting. The human ships were not purely digital, they were mechanical. Valves could be turned by hand, air could be pumped by pistons, engines could be ignited by spark. The junk technology, primitive and physical, was immune to the subtle frequencies of the null tide. The heavy armor plates did not need energy to exist, they just were. The human fleet, battered and burning, came back online. They were the only lights in a universe suddenly plunged into darkness. Vance watched the drifting, dying alien fleet on his passive radar. He could have finished them. He could have ordered his gunners to tear the helpless silver ships apart, ending the Ascendancy's threat forever. The crew looked to him, waiting for the order to fire. The anger was palpable. The aliens had called them trash, had tried to exterminate them. Revenge was easy. Revenge was logical. But Vance looked at the tactical plot, at the thousands of alien vessels drifting without life support, millions of lives fading in the cold. He remembered the philosophy of the scavenger. Nothing is wasted. Even an enemy is a resource. Even an enemy can be repurposed. "Signal the fleet," Vance rasped, his voice cutting through the bridge tension. "Deploy the grapples, prepare for towing operations. We're not leaving them to the dark." The order stunned the crew, but the discipline of the Rust fleets was absolute. The massive magnetic clamps designed to haul asteroids and wreckages were retargeted. The juggernauts moved in, not as executioners, but as saviors. The human ships, ugly and scarred, extended their towing cables, firing harpoons into the pristine hulls of the Ascendancy vessels. They latched onto the drifting graveyards of the alien armada. The humans rooted power from their own dirty, churning reactors through physical umbilical cables, drilling into the alien hulls to jumpstart their life support systems. It was a chaotic, violent rescue. Ascendancy crews, huddled in the freezing dark, watched as sparks flew, and the hulls of their ships groaned under the strain of being physically hauled by the barbarians. The image of that rescue would be burned into the galactic consciousness forever. The sleek, silver ships of the Ascendancy, lifeless and fragile, being carried on the backs of the massive, rusted human juggernauts. The humans dragged them into the nebula, into the shelter of the density fields they had created. There, behind the wall of junk, the null tide broke like a wave against a cliff. The sheer mass of the human fortress created a gravimetric shadow that dampened the storm's effects. The Ascendancy survived, not because of their elegance, but because they were shielded by the very refuse they had despised. In the aftermath, the political landscape of the galaxy was shattered and reformed. The High Archon Valorous was deposed, his philosophy of purity discredited by the reality of survival. Ambassador Xylos became the voice of the new era. The Ascendancy had to humble itself. They had to learn. They sent their engineers not to teach the humans, but to learn from them, to learn how to weld, how to forge, how to build things that did not disappear when the power went out. The spire of whispering light was modified. Heavy blast shields were installed over the crystal viewing ports, a gift from the Terran Engineering Corps. But the true twist, the revelation that cemented humanity's place not just as survivors but as masters, came during the peace talks aboard the Hephaestus. The null tide had passed, receding back into the intergalactic void, but the galaxy was changed. Xylos asked Vance about the origin of the fleet's core components. During the rescue, the alien engineers had seen things inside the human ships, technology that shouldn't have been there, beneath the layers of rust and welded. Scrap, there were hull plates made of a material the Ascendancy did not recognize, darker than black, absorbing light. Vance led Xylos deep into the bowels of the flagship, past the engine rooms, down into the keel of the vessel. There, stripped of the camouflage of debris, lay the truth. The junk that humanity had been scavenging was not random. The asteroid fields and dead stars they frequented were the site of an ancient war between the precursors and the null entities eons ago. The humans hadn't just been picking up trash, they had been excavating the corpses of gods. The keel of the Hephaestus was a fragment of a Star Eater-class dreadnought, a weapon of such magnitude that the galaxy had forgotten it existed. The humans had found these dormant, indestructible skeletons and built their civilization around them, wearing the junk like a disguise to hide the true power they possessed. "We didn't build the juggernauts to fight you," Vance said, his hand resting on the smooth, cold surface of the precursor metal that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic heartbeat. We built them to fight what's coming after the tide. The silence was just the wind before the storm. The entities that live in the dark are waking up. We needed armor. We needed to look weak so they wouldn't target us first. We played the part of the scavenger so we could build the sword. The realization struck Xylos with the force of a physical blow. The humans were not the cleaners of the galaxy. They were its wardens. They had spent centuries in the filth, ignored and mocked, silently preparing for a war that the Ascendancy was too arrogant to even perceive. The trash was a fortress. The rust was camouflage, and the humans, the calm, logical, ethical creatures who had saved their executioners, were the only thing standing between the galaxy and total extinction. The story of the junk to Juggernaut became a legend, but it was also a warning. The alliance between the Ascendancy and the Terran Republic was forged in that realization. The aliens provided the energy, the speed, the precision. The humans provided the mass, the endurance, the unstoppable will. Together, they began the work of reinforcing the galaxy. The beautiful silver ships were retrofitted with ablative armor. The human barges were fitted with harmonic shields. It was a marriage of the ethereal and the material. As the combined fleet moved out of the nebula to patrol the darkening borders, they looked different. They were no longer sleek needles or rusted blocks. They were something new, something terrifying and magnificent. They were the hammer and the anvil, and on the bridge of the Hephaestus, Admiral Vance looked out at the stars, no longer hidden behind shutters, and finally allowed himself a small, grim smile. The comeback was complete. Humanity had risen from the scrap heap to the throne, not by changing who they were, but by forcing the universe to acknowledge the value of what endures. The junk was gone. The Juggernaut remained. And for the first time in eons, the dark had a reason to be afraid. The diplomatic channels, once filled with the melodious, condescending tones of the Ascendancy, were now dominated by a new dialect, a fusion of high-tier harmonic mathematics and the brutal, efficient syntax of Sol Command. The council chambers on Ethelgard underwent a physical transformation mirroring the political one. The gravity nullifiers were lowered, allowing the councillors to feel the weight of their own bodies, a reminder of the physical stakes of existence. The view from the spire was no longer just the curated core worlds. It now included the live telemetry of the rim, the jagged, chaotic frontier where the Terrans held the line. The archives of the Ascendancy, once restricted to the purity of light history, were open to include the Books of Rust, the physical paper logs of the Terran captains that detailed the centuries of struggle in the dark. It was within these logs that the Ascendancy scholars found the depth of the human spirit they had so grossly underestimated. They read of the Great Scarcity, the era when Earth was lost, and humanity had to strip their own colony ships just to keep the life support running. They read of the Iron Vow, a cultural mandate that forbade the waste of any matter heavier than hydrogen. It was a philosophy born of desperation that had evolved into a religion of permanence. To the Ascendancy, a ship was a temporary vessel for consciousness. To a human, a ship was a legacy, passed down from parent to child, patched, expanded, and loved. A human ship was a family member. To destroy one was murder. This realization shamed the Ascendancy, who had discarded their own vessels the moment a newer model was theorized. The integration of the two fleets was not without friction. Ascendancy captains found the human obsession with manual override paranoid. Human engineers found the Ascendancy reliance on predictive algorithms suicidal. But the friction created heat, and heat, as the humans like to say, forged steel. Joint exercises were held. In the beginning, the Ascendancy ships would dance around the Terran behemoths, mocking their slowness, until the Terrans would flood the zone with flak and deploy gravity tethers, grounding the high-tech flyers like flies in amber. Then the roles would reverse. The Terrans would try to punch through a blockade, and the Ascendancy ships would weave a web of light so dense the humans couldn't navigate. Slowly, they learned. The Ascendancy ships gained armor plates and kinetic backup drivers. The Terran ships gained shield emitters and FTL drives that didn't rattle the teeth of the crew. But the true test of this new unity lay in the darkness that Vance had revealed. The precursor metal in the keel of the Hephaestus was not just armor, it was a receiver. As the galaxy settled into this uneasy new alliance, the receiver began to hum. It was a low frequency beneath the range of hearing, a vibration that rattled the bones. It was a signal from outside the galaxy. The null entities, the ancient enemy that the humans had been preparing for, were not just a force of nature. They were a civilization of antimatter and void, the antithesis of creation. They had sensed the survival of the Ascendancy during the null tide. They had tasted the resistance, and they were intrigued. The signal was decoded by a joint team of Guardian ciphers and Terran linguistic AIs. The message was simple, terrifying, and strangely formal. The cycle of silence has been interrupted. The echo persists. We are coming to correct the error. It was a declaration of war from the void itself. Panic threatened to consume the council again, but this time, the Terran presence in the chamber acted as an anchor. The human ambassador, a former heavy world miner named Galan, stood before the shimmering archons. He did not float. He stood with boots locked to the floor. He spoke of the history of Earth, of the wars fought in the mud, of the blitzes and the sieges. He told them that an enemy who announces themselves is an enemy who can be killed. "Let them come," Galan said, his voice echoing in the crystal hall. "They think they are coming to wipe out a bug infestation. They don't know they are walking into a minefield. We have the precursor hulls. We have your energy output. We are going to turn the rim into a meat grinder." The preparations began. The scale of the mobilization was unprecedented. The Terrans opened their secret vaults in the debris nebula, revealing not just more ships but planetary-scale engines. They had been converting dwarf planets into mobile fortresses. The junk concept was applied to celestial bodies. Massive asteroids were hollowed out, fitted with ascendancy singularity drives and Terran mass drivers. The ascendancy provided the targeting matrices, creating a defense grid that spanned light years. The galaxy was being fortified. The aesthetic was no longer important. Survival was the only metric. When the Void Hunters arrived, they did not come as a fleet of ships. They came as tears in reality, rifts that opened in the fabric of space, spilling out shadows that consumed light. These were entities that defied the laws of physics, ships made of solidified darkness that phased through conventional shields. The first engagement was a slaughter. The outer listening posts, manned by mixed crews, were erased before they could fire a shot. The shadows simply passed through them, and the life was gone, leaving cold metal tombs. The fear returned, the primal terror of the dark. But then the trap was sprung. The Terran juggernauts, the Hephaestus leading them, did not fire energy. They did not fire matter. They activated the precursor keels. The ancient metal, fed by the unlimited power of the Ascendancy's zero-point reactors, began to resonate. It created a reality anchor, a field of absolute physics that forced the Void Hunters to obey the laws of the material universe. The shadows were solidified. They were dragged out of their phased state and forced to become solid matter. And once they were matter, they could be hit. "Fire everything," Vance ordered. The galaxy lit up. It was not the clean, surgical fire of the Ascendancy past. It was a firestorm. Millions of railguns, missiles, plasma torpedoes, and particle lances fired in unison. The solidified void ships, caught by the anchor field, shattered. They broke apart like glass under a hammer. The scream of their destruction was heard on psychic planes across the sector. The humans and the aliens, fighting side by side, unleashed a fury that had been bottled up for centuries. The Ascendancy pilots, flying their armored needles, dove into the fray with a ferocity they had learned from their human counterparts. They rammed the enemy when their weapons ran dry. They boarded the shadow ships with plasma blades and shotguns. The battle lasted for weeks. It raged across a dozen systems. Debris piled up, creating new nebulas of wreckage. But the line held. The junk-to-juggernaut philosophy proved superior. The humans could repair their ships in the middle of combat, welding plates back on, bypassing destroyed circuits with wrenches and wire. The Ascendancy learned to reroute power through damaged conduits, keeping their shields up through sheer willpower. The Void Hunters, used to prey that shattered at the first touch, found themselves fighting a beast that refused to die. A beast that bit back. In the final confrontation, the flagship of the Void, a rip in space the size of a solar system, attempted to swallow the primary star of the Ethelgard home system. The Hephaestus, burning with the fires of overload, rammed the entity. It was a maneuver of pure human insanity. Vance drove the massive, precursor-reinforced prow of his ship directly into the heart of the anomaly. The impact rang the bell of the universe. The precursor metal reacted with the void energy, creating a feedback loop. The Ascendancy fleet poured every ounce of energy they had into the Hephaestus, using it as a conduit. The human ship became a star for a brief, blinding moment. The void ship imploded, the rift sealed. The threat was banished, pushed back into the dark from whence it came. The Hephaestus was a wreck. It was fused, melted, twisted beyond recognition, but it was still there. It drifted in the orbit of Ethelgard, a dark, ugly, beautiful scar against the perfection of the planet. Rescue teams found Vance and half his crew alive in the hardened citadel deep within the ship. They were pulled from the wreckage, covered in soot and blood, to be greeted not as scavengers, but as gods of war. The high archons bowed, physically bowed. It was a gesture that had not been seen in 10,000 years. The war ended, but the peace that followed was different. It was a vigilant peace. The galaxy understood now that tranquility was not a natural state. It was a fortress that had to be built and maintained. The Terran Republic and the Ascendancy formally merged into the Alliance of the Iron Star. The symbol of the new government was a cog interlocking with a beam of light. Years later, on the anniversary of the victory, a ceremony was held. Not in a crystal spire, but on the hull of the decommissioned Hephaestus, which had been turned into a museum and a memorial. Children of both species ran across the scarred plating. Ethelgardian youths, their robes shorter and more practical, played with human children who wore exosuits. They traced the weld marks with their fingers, reading the names of the crew etched into the steel. Ambassador Xylos, now very old, stood next to a retired Vance. They looked out at the fleet on parade. It was a magnificent sight, massive dreadnoughts that combined the sleek curves of the Ascendancy with the brutalist architecture of Earth. They were ships that could sail the ether and smash through planets. They were the ultimate expression of the lesson learned, that the spirit is the energy, but the body is the anchor. "We used to think you were picking through the trash," Xylos mused, his voice frail but warm. Vance chuckled, the sound like grinding gears. "We were," he said, "but you know what they say, one man's trash is another man's." "Juggernaut," Xylos finished. "Ultimate weapon," Vance corrected softly. "The ultimate weapon isn't a laser or a cannon, it's the refusal to give up. It's the ability to take the broken pieces of your life and weld them into something stronger. That's what we do, that's what humanity is. We are the glue, we are the rust that holds the iron together." The camera of history pulled back, revealing the galaxy not as a collection of separate lights, but as a unified web of iron and energy, spinning in the dark, defiant and eternal. The junk had saved the jewel, and in doing so had become more precious than diamond. The comeback was not just a military victory, it was a philosophical triumph. The universe was vast and cold, but the fire of the Alliance burned hot, fueled by the debris of the past, lighting the way for a future that would never again be afraid of the dark. The final legacy of the Terrans was not the war, but the Great Reconstruction. With the threat gone, the humans turned their juggernauts to a new purpose. They went to the dead worlds, the cracked moons, the places the Ascendancy had written off as spent. They used their gravity tethers to pull atmospheres back together. They used their kinetic drivers to restart the rotation of dead cores. They used the trash to build biospheres. They were terraforming the galaxy, one scrap heap at a time. The Ascendancy watched in awe as gardens bloomed from rust. They realized that the humans were not just survivors, they were gardeners of the entropy. They were the only species that could look at a graveyard and see a nursery. And deep in the void, far beyond the Rhea, the HF sensors, the other entities, watched too. They watched the Alliance of the Iron Star, and they decided to stay in the shadows. For they knew now that this galaxy was not soft. It was armored, it was welded, and it was guarded by the mongrel dogs of Saul, who had turned their kennel into a castle and their junk into the juggernaut that broke the night. The story of humanity was no longer a tragedy of scavengers. It was the epic of the builders, the ones who took the broken things and made them whole. The ultimate comeback was not returning to what was lost, but building something that had never existed before, a galaxy that could not be broken. The silence of the council chamber was gone forever, replaced by the roar of engines and the laughter of a species that had looked death in the face and sold it for scrap.